Well, what do you get when a convicted killer tries to stage manage his legacy from death row? Chad Daybell's new prison letters are less a private outpouring and more a calculated rebranding, religious framing, family testimony, nostalgic anecdotes, and the promise of more to come. Now, in this episode, we're going to pull back the curtain on those letters. We're going to trace the psychological playbook in hand, the narcissistic supply, image control, and the strategic seeding of an appeals narrative. We're going to map the players: Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow, Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, JJ Vallow. I hope not to forget Charles Vallow, frankly, Alex Cox, and many others. Then we're going to drop in other critical figures who appear in the bleed through of the story. Now, the variant people involved in this thing I want to talk about too as we go along, but the witnesses who testified, local law enforcement, those in Rexburg and Fremont County, FBI agents, and the prosecutors who built the case. This is equal parts courtroom forensics, cult leader theater, and behavioral profile, all aimed at the listeners who want to see the rhetorical tricks that this guy's pulling, the legal signals, and the people who keep getting pulled back into this tragic orbit. Well, hey everybody, welcome to Profiling Evil. I'm coming from the ranch. I'm up here for a couple of days, and I thought I'd share 5 of my favorite locations. This lookout, just over my shoulder here in the distance, you can see Park City Resort. You know, if you've been following the Doomsday Daybell case, you already know the grim outcome. It was a doomsday-tinged relationship, missing children, a murdered wife, and piles of evidence in the trial, and sentences that were intended to be final. Chad Daybell was convicted of 3 murders, and he's been sentenced to death. Now, a jury in Idaho decided that back in 2024. Now listen, as we get started, hit the like and subscribe button, ring the bell, turn on your notifications, and share Profiling Evil with your friends. Now, when a man in Chad Daybell's position starts publishing a string of letters from death row, letters that his daughter now is posting online for the world to read, it really matters. It matters how he's using his voice. And as much as it sickens me to give this guy any press time, it really bothered me. In fact, it angered me, and I want to talk a little bit about it. The question becomes, is he going through some reckoning, confessing? Is he offering concrete accountability? Or is this whole thing about rebranding himself? Trying to humanize himself, trying to rewrite the record so that followers and fence sitters can retreat into a new story that minimizes the victims and softens Chad Daybell's culpability. Now, this behavior isn't new. In fact, we've seen recent examples where pop culture figures, famous individuals, and even politicians have tried to rewrite the past, hoping that if they say it enough times, people will begin to believe it. I mean, think back 80 years to Nazi Germany. The term the big lie, or grosse Lüge, was coined by Adolf Hitler in the Mein Kampf to describe the propaganda that was used in World War I. Now, Goebbels later adapted and articulated the theory more fully in an article that was written in 1941, explaining how a state can maintain a lie by repressing any dissenting truths, utilizing all of its powers. The core idea behind the big lie is that a sufficiently large and frequently repeated falsehood can actually become accepted as truth by the public. And aren't we seeing that a little bit in some of our theaters today? Now, the principle of the big lie has been studied in the context of truth effect, where repeated exposure to false information can make people believe that it's true. Chad Daybell's letters, in my opinion, land overwhelmingly in the second camp. And you can listen to them at the end of this discussion, or you can frankly just go to lettersfromchad.com, that website that his daughter stood up, and view them personally. But before I go line by line, I want to be immovably clear about the foundational facts, because they matter when we call out this rewriting attempt that's going on. On May 31st, 2024, a jury found Chad Daybell guilty of murdering his first wife, Tammy Daybell, and murdering Lori Vallow's two children, Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow. Now, a short time later, the jury recommended the death penalty, and on June 1st of 2024, Chad Daybell was formally sentenced to death. Now, those are legal outcomes. They were reached after a long trial that included physical evidence, cross-examination, witness testimony, and forensic examination. The remains of Tylee and JJ were recovered from unmarked graves on property owned by Chad Daybell in his backyard. That was in June of 2020. And forensic work tied those remains to the missing children. And investigators presented bone fragments, personal items, and excavation evidence during the cases that was heart-wrenching. Prosecutors framed the deaths as part of a pattern, an extramarital relationship that Chad was having with Lori Vallow, a belief system that branded certain people as spiritually possessed. You'll remember them, the zombies. And a motive profile that included financial gain and personal gains. Now, it was clear to me during the trial that Chad knew exactly what was buried in this backyard of his. He watched as the investigators were unearthing those beautiful children, and he was talking to Lori on the phone saying, they're in the backyard, and he was pretty dang depressed during that. He knew what they were going to find. All of this happened before he attempted to flee the area and was arrested. Now, Lori Vallow, Chad's romantic partner and later his wife, she was convicted in Idaho in 2023 for the killings of her children and for related charges to the death of Tammy. And she's since faced and been convicted on additional conspiracy murder charges in Arizona. She's received multiple life terms in the Idaho proceedings and later convictions that were adding more life sentences in Arizona. In short, folks, both Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, who became Lori Daybell, both of them were convicted by juries, and they faced the gravest consequences the criminal justice system can impose. Now, these are immutable facts. They're on public record. So keep them in mind as we look at the letter that Chad writes, as he tries hard to place the Chad Daybell he wants us to know back into those quiet, gentler neighbor frame time frames. Now, that's a time when he thinks it erases the forensic footprint of his crimes. So let's dive into that first letter, beginning with the opening line. Quote, "Hello, my friends. This is Chad Daybell, writing to you from my cell in Idaho's maximum security institution. Now, this is the first of several letters I will send," he writes. He goes on to say, "I want to thank everybody who sent me cards and letters while I've been incarcerated. Your kind words of support really helped me. I cherished each one," close quote. Now, I don't know about you, but it kind of gags me because on the face of this, it seems warm and intimate. And that's the entire point, I believe. The greeting is functional rhetoric, and he's re-anchoring himself as the man his supporters knew, rather than the man who committed homicide against his wife and his lover's children. That rhetorical move is the bedrock of this rebranding plan that he's got going. It does two things at once. It humanizes him, perhaps making viewers say, wow, I can't imagine him as a happy family man. And it signals to his network that they are seen, they're noticed, and they're needed. The phrase, quote, "I cherish each one," close quote, is recruitment language. Make no mistake about this. It's disguised as gratitude. but it supports supportive emotional things into ongoing loyalty. That's what manipulators call this narcissistic supply thing. Attention used as fuel to sustain an idealized self-image. Now, catch this next line, because here is where the rewrite becomes an attempt to erase culpability. He says, quote, "I'm aware of how I've been portrayed in the media. Frankly, those portrayals of me are unrecognizable. I'm not the man the media has created. I'm not a cult member who should be feared. I'm not a conspirator or a killer. I never have been," close quote. Well, folks, in my opinion, this isn't humility. That is denial staged as a corrective to all of us. It's not enough to deny in private. He's trying to pull us into the denial. Look at the absolutism of the language, the "I have never been." That rhetorical structure doesn't invite nuance. It closes down inquiry. And that's how rewriting works. Repeat the alternative narrative until it cushions the edges of reality. Now, the record, again, tells us a much different story. Remember, investigators found bodies on his property of 2 children. The prosecution presented physical evidence and a chain of communications and behaviors that link him to the concealment and the events that resulted in Tammy's death and, of course, JJ and Tylee's death. And I want you to hold that real prosecutorial scaffolding in one hand while you read or listen to Chad's lines in the other, because that juxtaposition is just where the offense sits. The letter strives to replace forensic fact with sentimental anecdotes. He tries now to make his isolation sound like spiritual pilgrimage too, and that really offends me. Now he says, quote, "While I was in the Fremont County jail, I spent thousands of hours in an isolation cell. I wasn't allowed to have a clock, and it often felt like time stood still." He goes on to say, "During those challenging days, I would reflect on my life, working forward from childhood to more recent years. As memories came to me, I would write down the names of the people who had been positive influences in my life," close quote. Well, I wonder if Lori Daybell's name was written down there. Because right there, the language of a man doing inner work, in isolation, he cataloged positive influences. Now, you got to hand it to him. It could be the start of real contrition. It could also be a neat interior stage set for a man who wants to appear reflective without ever naming the terrible acts that he's been found guilty of committing. The letter tells us that he worked forward from childhood. Now that's the rhetoric of re-storytelling, drawing a plausible human lineage from a boy who built a bookshelf to this adored family man to condemned hero of his own thoughts. It's powerful, but it's intentionally so. Because here's what the letter omits in a way that's impossible to ignore. It barely, if all, deals with Lori Vallow. There's no grappling with their shared plans. There's no clear account of the texts and the meetings and the timelines and the secret portals, all those things that the jury heard about. And there's no explicit exploration of the relationship that prosecutors said was central to the motive and the execution of those 3 people. In a case in which Chad's intimacy with Lori, her radical beliefs and her role as a co-defendant, frankly, her eventual convictions, those things were central evidence, he's silent about her, and it's deafening. Because when a principal partner in a criminal enterprise is nowhere in your "here's what I regret" paragraphs, that absence speaks more loudly than any denials that he's making. And if you want a legal strategy, you'd keep that silence. If you want true contrition and moral clarity, you'd break the silence and you'd name the role that the relationship played. And I want to be really blunt. For anybody who's lost loved ones in this case, that silence is inadequate. But more importantly, it's offensive. Why? Because these letters are public now. He's taking up this narrative oxygen that the victims' families have to consume. They don't get to spend rewriting things. He's mounting a staged version of his life that softens the horrible acts and invites compassion for the actor while leaving the victims and their families with a public record that's now contested in the court of public opinion. And that's the injury. The reframe competes with grief. And cases like this are exactly the reason that I wrote my book, Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, because I've spent decades watching predators use language, not to just justify their actions, but to conceal and confuse. They bend words like steal, fashioning weapons out of sentences that keep people second-guessing their own instincts. In the Daybell case, we see it in real time. Chad's letters from death row are a perfect example of how language is deployed to soften reality, how it's used to blur culpability, and how it's used to reshape memories. The playbook doesn't change. It still creates confusions. Frame yourself as the misunderstood hero and recruit sympathy where, frankly, none is deserved. And if you want to dive deeper into how predators of all kinds, cult leaders, abusers, criminals, twist words to keep control, I cover it all in detail in Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. And for those of you in my Profiling Evil family, there are signed copies available with free delivery anywhere in the United States through my website, profilingevil.com. And if you're outside of the US, just go to Amazon and you can pick it up in paperback, hardback, ebook, and even audiobook. Now, I personally think that these letters are a precursor to appeals, and Chad Daybell, frankly, explicitly states that he's working on his appeals. In the letter excerpts and in public reporting that confirms that these letters began showing up on social media feeds and this website managed by his daughter, all point to an obvious vehicle to shape public sympathy ahead of any appellate work. The tactical logic is obvious. If you soften enough hearts in the public, and perhaps among potential clemency influencers, you may generate political pressure. You might generate some funds, and you might get a sympathetic narrative that complicates this already narrow legal route for capital penalty cases. And in my opinion, if you need one line that sums up the manipulative strategy, it's a sentence in the letter where he says, quote, "I don't have all the answers even now, but I'm grateful a more complete story will be shared during my appeals process," close quote. Well, that's not an admission. Again, it's an offer and a challenge for you to keep following the series, because he's going to keep telling the story until enough of you buy it. So I want to just shift gears a little bit and look at some of the behavioral context. And first, I want to start out with this narcissism pattern that we're seeing. Chad's letter displays textbook features. There's the need for admiration. You remember that one? Quote, "I cherished each one." The insistence on being the popular, quote, "quiet, gentle," close quote, man. This image management that's going on, this effort to minimize wrongdoing, the denial and the absolutes, and the use of family testimony as social proof. Hey, my relatives give me the same response. This guy hasn't changed. Narcissistic personalities protect their core self-image by reinterpreting reality. The legal record is an existential threat to that image. Rewriting it publicly is a defense mechanism with recruitment value. Now, the second reason is the gaslighting and impression management that's going on. Gaslighting is not only private, it can be performed for mass audiences. You see, because when he writes, quote, "I assure you my heart was breaking many times throughout the trial," close quote, all the time that he was sitting stone-faced in court, that's retrospective emotional substitution. He's attempting to manufacture empathy retroactively, and he's trying to do damage control for his flat, unemotional effect. But don't be fooled by it. It's possible, it's just possible, that it's his personality. But I watched that same face as he glumped alongside Lori Daybell in Hawaii. I watched that same face as he sat through her first court appearances. And I watched that same face throughout his entire criminal justice experience. That is impression management, designed to alter how the courtroom demeanor is remembered by you and me. And don't forget that flat demeanor during court. He didn't stand up and say, "No, that isn't what happened." He sat there and he allowed it to go on. Number 3, the cult dynamics. The prosecution's theory, reported across outlets and presented at trial, all emphasized that shared delusion. There was a small in-group that was convinced that certain people were spiritually possessed or zombies. Now that shared belief system justified things in their minds. Most importantly, it justified extreme acts. The behavior of a charismatic leader in closed groups is often followed by a pattern of moral inversion. This thing of bad is actually good. Murder is a form of deliverance. But the rhetoric in those letters tries to reclaim spiritual identity while pretending that the violence was never part of it. Don't buy the gloss, folks. The prosecution presented texts, evidence, and timelines that tied belief to action. Fourth, the legal and strategic realities. Death row communications are not neutral. Public statements can be used in clemency petitions or in broader social media campaigns to influence policymakers and those of us in the public. But even more tactical, a steady drip of humanizing content keeps followers engaged and donors sometimes willing to fund appeals. He is explicitly saying that he's working on the pills. His daughter's posting the letters publicly, and both facts line up with a standard PR legitimation tactics for a high-stakes case. But let me just pause and err on the side of compassion, because true compassion does not equal exoneration. So I want to make that very clear. It's possible, in principle, for a human being to move from denial to real acceptance. It's a psychological arc that usually shows up in stages like private admissions, the naming of specifics, acknowledging victims by their name with clear ownership of your role in murdering them, and making reparative gestures where possible. Now, in that same fairness that I'm saying it's possible, I want to say I have absolutely not seen any of it in the behaviors of Chad Daybell. Now, he doesn't make public statements, but these letters are the thing that's pushing me to believe that there is no way he's ready to admit that he committed homicides. Now, genuine remorse tends to manifest consistently across contexts. It manifests itself in private family statements that diverge from the public spin that's out there. It manifests itself in cooperation with investigators beyond what's legally required. It manifests itself in the avoidance of further manipulation, in maybe going as far as saying, "Hey, I'll be happy to meet with families if they want," but he's not doing it. These are the real markers we would look for before seriously trusting any of these letters that are flirting with empathy. And again, in my opinion, the letters that we're discussing, they now only gesture at feelings. One thing he says in this letter, quote, "I share in your sadness, pain, and grief over the deaths of Tammy, Tylee, and JJ," close quote. But then almost immediately he hedges with the quote, "I don't have all the answers," close quote. That's the pattern of ambiguous, self-protective remorse, not of unequivocal ownership based on contrition. And you know what? Those murders didn't happen in a spree. They happened individually. There was a period of time to get your senses about you if you really thought, "Hey, wait a minute, I just murdered somebody and that's wrong." But that's not what happened. If someone genuinely says, "I did this," the details and the decisions that led to the acts would be a different thing, and they would be sharing those. And we haven't seen that from Chad Daybell. And I personally find these letters offensive. And here's the next hard fact. Even if Chad were to arrive tomorrow at a place of full, private acceptance of responsibility, that wouldn't erase the legal facts, the murders of 3 people, and the families that now experience so much pain because of his and Lori Vallow Daybell's actions. Remorse can, at best, be a part of moral accounting, but it's not a substitute for justice. You can feel compassion for the complex psychological anguish that might accompany the realization of a crime like this, and still insist that the legal consequences have to remain in force. Those positions are not contradictory. They require different responses from different institutions. And the criminal justice system has to enforce consequence. Moral communities can reckon with repentance if they want. Now, let's get specific about why these letters are so galling, even to people who are willing to entertain the nuance of them. First, they are an absolute distraction. They divert conversation from the evidence and the victims to the man, Chad Daybell, who caused this harm. That's a classic decentering move, where the public once had a fairly straightforward narrative. Those awful acts, the evidence, the trials, the verdicts. The letters reopen the narrative in a way that centers back on Chad Daybell. To survivors and the victims' families, that's just re-victimizing them. And it asks them to share the cultural stage with the man who harmed them. I've had the opportunity to talk to several of the family members of the perpetrators in this case. They deserve to have these victims memorialized and protected. When you think about these letters, the second thing that bugs me is they sanitize the story. The tone, this bookshelf story of the Christian radio references, these are small but benign tropes that make Chad Daybell kind of seem ordinary. He references life everlasting and K-love. Well, that's not an accident. It's halo polishing. He somehow wants you to associate him with faith, home projects, music, not with shallow graves, ritualistic ramblings, and coercive texts. That rhetorical gloss reduces cognitive dissonance for his audience. And the more ordinary Chad Daybell appears to you, the less plausible the brutality seems. The third thing that really bugs me about these letters, they omit the co-actor. Again, Chad's minimal engagement with Lori Vallow in these publicized letters is a glaring absence. Their relationship was the axis around which many prosecutive narratives turned. She was convicted in Idaho and later in Arizona on related conspiracies. Yet Chad's letters treat the world as though the story is mainly about his public image. Well, that omission isn't neutral. It's a boundary work, drawing this line between what the letter will and won't address. And people are going to understandably ask, why won't he talk about Lori? The woman that he snuck off with, the woman he married a few weeks after murdering his decades-long wife. That woman, Lori Vallow, was his co-defendant. That woman whose actions the public might rightly fear and examine. Remember, she helped him murder 2 children. She helped him murder his wife, Tammy. If he were truly trying to be transparent and accountable, Lori's role, at least in the narrow sense of what happened, and when it happened, would be squarely confronted, not skirted about. These letters appear to be an appeal strategy, in my opinion. Chad Daybell says he's focused on appeals, and the timing of these public letters appearing on a daughter-run social media site fits the model of a public narrative management strategy. Now, that's not conspiratorial thinking. It's just legal PR. Humanize Chad Daybell. Mobilize whatever sympathizers might believe the guy, and keep the story alive, but it's only the story that he's writing, and hope that you might influence that very narrow political and social group under which clemency or other relief might be considered. Folks, this is tactical, and yes, it is offensive to anybody who believes in punishment and accountability for murder. This should not be undisputed, and it shouldn't be uninterrupted by public PR campaigns. Chad Daybell's letters are not an honest reckoning, in my opinion. They are an exercise in impression management. Gratitude for adoring notes converts attention into loyalty. Nostalgic anecdotes humanize and obscure. References to faith create moral authority and promises of more to come in the appeals. And all of this is work as a campaign to keep the narrative alive. Chad Daybell uses family testimony as social proof. He substitutes retrospective tears for courtroom demeanor. And he conspicuously avoids sustained treatment of Lori Vallow's role in these murders. His partner, his co-defendant, the same person that was convicted and sentenced of murder. The letters are a public performance aimed at bending public sentiment. And for anybody who cares about justice for Tammy, Tylee, and JJ, that is deeply, viscerally offensive. And folks, if you want to dig deeper into this thing, you can follow one of my go-tos. It's newspapers.com, because it's not always about headlines that end up on social media, but it's about the stories that are written at the local level. I use newspapers.com constantly when I'm tracking down narratives. And I've arranged for a Profiling Evil deal for any of you who are interested in newspapers.com, that you can get 20% off on a membership if you go to this link. And you see it down below, but it's also in the description area. And I hope it's clear how offended I am by these letters, but at the same time, to be intellectually honest, human beings are messy people. And it's possible, but not in my opinion evident from the current letters, that isolation, memory work, and the collapse of a previously coherent identity could force shards of recognition to fall where they will. Now, if that happens in private and is followed by consistent public acts of ownership and genuine attempts to repair, to the extent that repair would be possible, then compassion should be our humane response. But it doesn't soften the demands for accountability. And frankly, I don't see it in Chad Daybell's letters. So my recommendation is that you listen to or read Chad Daybell's letters with a critical lens. Match them back to the record that you know, the excavation reports, the dead bodies, the cell phone pings, the text messages, the witness testimony, and the jury's finding of a death sentence. Demand specific acknowledgments, not these poetic generalities. And above all, folks, keep the victims at the center of your thoughts. Remember their names, their lives, and the ways that their families are forced to live with this rebranding attempt that Chad Daybell's trying to make. You know, to make this listening of his letters a little easier, I decided to use an AI voice to read the letters, especially for those of you who are listening to this while you're on the go. So let's listen to that letter, and then after I make a few comments, I want you to listen to what I think he's really saying. So I'm going to recreate the letter in my language of what he's trying to say.
Letter number 1. Hello, my friends. This is Chad Daybell, writing to you from my cell in Idaho's maximum security institution. This is the first of several letters I will send. I want to thank everyone who sent me cards and letters while I have been incarcerated. Your kind words of support really helped me. I cherished each one. I arrived here at the prison in June 2024, and I suppose you could say I've settled in. As for death row itself, I won't be sharing details about my daily schedule or information about my fellow inmates. As the newest arrival on death row, it isn't my place to talk about such things. It really is a different world in here, but I'm surviving, and I spend a lot of time working on my upcoming appeals. I express my gratitude to each of you who have been part of my life. While I was in the Fremont County Jail, I spent thousands of hours in an isolation cell. I wasn't allowed to have a clock, and it often felt like time stood still. During those challenging days, I would reflect on my life, working forward from childhood to more recent years. As memories came to me, I would write down the names of the people who had been positive influences in my life. I felt strengthened as I remembered my extended family members, neighbors, coworkers, school classmates, business associates, church members, and friends I have been privileged to know. You have all enriched my life in so many ways. I am using this method to share my story because I want you to receive it uncensored and unfiltered, directly from me. I am aware of how I have been portrayed in the media. Frankly, those portrayals of me are unrecognizable. I am not the man the media has created. I am not a cult member who should be feared. I am not a conspirator or a killer. I never have been. I am a father, a grandfather, a husband, a son, a brother, and a friend with a firm faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I have recently been able to have a few in-person visits with several of my family members, and those have been wonderful. I will always be grateful for the unconditional love and support these family members have given me. When people find out that my relatives have visited me, they usually ask them, "How has he changed?" My relatives give the same response: "He hasn't changed. He's the same Chad we always knew." People are surprised by that answer after hearing a different story for so long. I am still the quiet, gentle person you all know. I have always been a peacemaker, even now in prison. I have never caused anyone's death, and never conspired to commit such acts against anyone. I share in your sadness, pain, and grief over the deaths of Tammy, Tylee, and JJ. I don't have all the answers even now. But I'm grateful a more complete story will be shared during my appeals process. During my court trial, I followed my attorney's advice to sit quietly, not smile, and not show any emotion as evidence was presented. I know that is standard protocol for defendants in the courtroom, but I realize now that it made me appear to be cold and uncaring, which is the opposite of who I am. I assure you, my heart was breaking many times throughout the trial, and there were moments I couldn't hold back the tears, especially as I saw and heard family members suffering the same feelings of anguish that I was experiencing. A key purpose of these letters is to share with you what I had hoped would have been explained in court. I will strive to make each letter informative and worth your time. I fully realize many people will never change their negative opinion of me. In this age of social media, podcasts, and the merging of the mainstream media with law enforcement, very few defendants are portrayed in a positive way. All I can hope for is that these letters can begin to generate feelings of healing, reconciliation, and understanding. Thanks again, my friends, for the many ways you have helped and inspired me throughout my life.
Well, there you go. In reality, this all reads like a really crummy play. Something that I would call the Chameleon Prophet from Cell Block C. It has all of the things you might expect. An opening line of, "Hello, my friends, this is Chad Daybell writing from maximum security. But watch for the rebranding. I'm Chad Daybell, not the convicted murderer you've come to know, but your friend, Chad. That same warm guy you supposedly knew back when I was writing doomsday novels and spinning end-of-times prophecies." In Act 2, this is a guy who will be harvesting your sympathy by claiming that he wants everybody to send him cards and letters. Remember, he's saying your words are cherished. Well, this isn't about thanking you. It's about demonstrating that he still has followers. In Act 3, he's going to remind you that he's still a martyr, saying, "Hey, I arrived here in prison and I've had to settle into death row." Whatever. But notice the blend of humility and agenda. He says, "It isn't my place." Well, doesn't that sound meek? It's also a way of signaling that he's above prison gossip, that he's set apart. Theologically speaking, he's styling himself still as a prophet in exile, not a felon in a jumpsuit. And he describes his time in the Fremont County jail, where he says he spent those thousands of hours in isolation. I think what he's trying to do is remind you that he thinks he was like a monk in a remote Thailand temple. There he turned his solitary confinement into spiritual exercises. Remember his comment? during those challenging days, I would reflect on my life. Whatever. All right, folks, I'm going to try to read the letter as I think Chad Daybell would have been thinking as he's writing. So we'll start with letter number 1. Hello, my friends. This is Chad Daybell coming to you live from Idaho's maximum security institution, better known as the place where the state of Idaho parks the worst of the worst. But don't think of me like that. I mean, no. This is the first of several heartfelt letters that I'm going to be sending out. And the translation for me is, let me drip feed you my rebranding campaign, one carefully curated letter at a time. First, I want to thank everyone who sent me cards and letters. You see, if I mention kindness and gratitude right out of the gate, I get points for being the gentle spiritual leader instead of the convicted child killer. Now, I'm settling in on death row. I arrived here in June of 2024, and I suppose you could say that I've settled in. Notice how I use this homey kind of language, like I just unpacked boxes in a new apartment, instead of admitting that I'm in a cell for the rest of my natural life. And I won't share details about my daily routine or my fellow inmates, because the less you know, the easier it is for me to control this story. Also, prison life doesn't exactly paint me as a humble prophet, the kind of person you want to imagine. So I'm going to play the isolation card. Because if you remember, back when I was in Fremont County Jail, I spent thousands of hours in an isolation cell. No clock, no sense of time. It was just me and my carefully rehearsed narrative of innocence. This is where I realized that if I write my own story enough times in my head, maybe someone out there will also believe it. So I started writing down the names of positive influences in my life. Now, positive is a nice word, don't you think? I mean, it makes me sound like the kind of guy that you'd want as your next door neighbor. Not the guy convicted of killing his wife and his lover's kids, because you see, the media got me all wrong. Here's the pivot, though. I want you to know that everything you've read, everything you've heard about me is unrecognizable, at least according to me. And frankly, according to me, I'm not a cult leader, I'm not a conspirator, and I'm absolutely not a murderer. This is where I try to rewrite reality. And I believe if I say it enough times, maybe it'll wash away the courtroom evidence, those graves they found in my backyard, or the autopsies. Instead, I want you just to look at me as a father, a grandfather, a husband, son, brother, friend. Notice how I pile on every possible family role here. I mean, this is psychological image repair 101. Stack reliable tiles so that people think, wait a minute, killers can't be grandpas who are spiritual, can they? Then I want my family to serve as character witnesses, because I have had family visitors and they all say the same thing. They say that I haven't changed, and that's perfect. That's exactly the narrative I want. That I'm the same Chad as I was before. Then the only thing that I must have changed is the story. The story that the state told about me. This is a brilliant scapegoat play. And by the way, I'm still the quiet, gentle peacemaker that I've always been. Just ignore the fact that 3 people connected to me ended up dead in brutal, suspicious circumstances. Just focus on the word gentle and repeat it. Believe it. Because I want to think about that courtroom performance as well. Because if you remember, during my trial, I followed my lawyer's advice, or at least that's what I'm going to tell you, to sit still, to not smile, don't cry. But the result? Apparently, I looked cold and uncaring, which, if we're honest, matched the evidence in the case. But let's not admit that. Instead, I'm now going to tell you that my heart was breaking throughout the whole thing, and that I actually cried sometimes, because retroactive emotion sells well when you write letters like this one. So here's what I really want. These letters are to say that I want y'all to heal. I want to heal. I want reconciliation, and I want to create understanding. But the secret agenda here, it's all about rebranding myself, to turn my narrative into one of a misunderstood spiritual visionary. I don't want you thinking about me as a convicted murderer. And if I can muddy the waters just enough, maybe a podcast or two will pick me up as a sympathetic figure, maybe even sway public perception before my appeals. And that's why I threw out the bookshelf parable. So let's talk about a bookshelf I built in junior high. You see what I did here? I humanized myself. I'm not a monster. I'm not the guy that you look at as a monster named Chad. I'm Handy Chad, the guy who builds furniture, not the guy who buries bodies. And on that bookshelf, there are spiritual books, of course, because nothing says trust me like aligning myself with religious texts that promise life after death, even if I don't practice what I preach. It's the ultimate subliminal plea. Don't worry about the bodies, folks. They're in a better place, and I'm the guy who understands the better place better than anyone. Oh, and those musical notes? Yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll wrap this letter up with music. I think it's a smart move because music ties memory to emotion. And if I can get you humming along with me, I sneak under your defenses. And one song I'm going to highlight is I'm So Blessed. It's a catchy Christian tune because nothing says I'm innocent like aligning myself with upbeat faith music while I sit here on death row for murdering children. Here's the real script that Chad Daybell's running, in my opinion. Step one, deny, deny, deny. Step two, humanize through family, hobbies, and faith. Step three, slip in selective sorrow, but never guilt, always grief. And step four, rebrand yourself from killer to martyr of misunderstanding. And then step number five, dangle hope, the hope of a bigger story in appeals so that followers keep tuning in. And I hope, folks, that you don't keep tuning in. But I got to say, you don't want to miss letter number 2 that's coming up. What a saintly picture he's painting, reflecting, journaling, honoring mentors. But folks, this isn't a confession. There's no mention of his victims. There's no acknowledgement of his own brutality. It's a self-stroking exercise. And make no mistake, Act 4 is going to show that this unchanged prophet brags that he's still that same quiet, gentle person, calling himself a peacemaker, even now in prison. A peacemaker, I might add, that was convicted of murdering 2 children and his wife. Act 5, it'll reveal that he was secretly crying inside during the trial, even though you couldn't see it. Remember, he says, during my court trial, I followed my attorney's advice to sit quietly, to not smile, and to not show any emotion as evidence was presented. Well, now he's ready to step forward as a healing prophet, someone who declares that a key purpose of his letters is to share what he couldn't explain in court, hoping that it might cause you to have feelings of healing, reconciliation, and understanding. And while his daughter points out that he's not going to benefit financially, if they find a way to ask for money to help in his defense, I guarantee it's going to come. Make no mistake about it. The final act is, to me, a ritual of denial. The entire letter is ritualistic, in my opinion. It reads more like a liturgy for his remaining followers. It opens like a sermon. He expresses gratitude for support and believing in him. He claims his innocence and makes devotional recommendations. It's ritual crime psychology in reverse. using sacred framing to mask his profane actions. In the end, I think Chad Daybell's rebranding is a con. His story ends where it began, with manipulation. He isn't writing for cathartic reasons. He's writing to rebrand himself, to retain followers, to recast himself as a martyr, to somehow humanize himself through nostalgia, and through the insertion of religion as a moral cover. And perhaps most importantly, his plan is to plant seeds for an appellate court, for clemency boards, or for future jurors who might one day read his letters from prison and think to themselves, hey, wait, maybe this man really was misunderstood. And I'd like your thoughts. Do you think Chad Daybell's letters are compelling, or do you find them offensive? Please enter your comments down below and be kind with each other. And please watch for my review of letter number 2, which should be released shortly after this one. And remember that you can find Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you like your true crime on the go, check out Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. You know, there's a reason Profiling Evil was nominated for the 2025 CrimeCon People's Choice Award, and we are so grateful for all of you who cast your vote. We'll keep working on content that's worth listening to, and I hope you'll keep sharing us with your friends. And make sure you're checking out Profiling Evil's website at profilingevil.com. And while you're there, sign up for our digital newsletter, The BOLO. It stands for Be on the Lookout, and the only way you get the BOLO is by signing up online, but I won't share your information ever. Thanks again for your support. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.